Good evening. What a wonderful program. We are so glad you were able to join us today. I'm Maggie Linton. As we get started, I want to remind you that Spiritual Audacity, the Abraham Joshua Heschel story, will air on MPT Saturday, May 8th at 8 p.m. and again at 9 p.m. It will also be available for streaming online, so please visit mpt.org for more three remarkable men this evening whom you'll be excited to meet. I'm honored first to introduce you to the man who put it all together, Martin Doblmeier. He's founder and president of Journey Films in Alexandria, Virginia. Since 1985, Martin has produced more than 35 documentary films, all on topics of religion, faith, and spirituality. Many of these films have been nationally put out and released in cooperation with Maryland Public Television. Martin has degrees in religious studies and journalism, as well as 3 honorary degrees. His films have won many top awards, including 3 regional Emmys, as well as the prestigious Wilbur Award for this very film. Martin is a popular speaker on and appears regularly on television, radio, and podcast. Welcome, Martin. And Benjamin Sachs is a Jewish scholar at the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies in Baltimore. Ben has published works on topics relating to Jewish philosophy, German Jewish history and culture, Jewish Christian relations, and interreligious dialogue. Ben's most recent project includes a book titled The Life of Quotation in Modern Jewish Thought, and it will be published next year. And Rabbi Jack Moline is president of the Interfaith Alliance. He is also Rabbi Emeritus of Agudas Achmin Congregation in Alexandria, Virginia, where he served in the pulpit for 27 years. The rabbi is an adjunct faculty member of the Jewish Theological Seminary in Virginia Theological Seminary. He served as co-chair of the Virginia Commission on Diversity, Equality, and Inclusion, appointed by Governor Terry McAuliffe following the Charlottesville incident. Rabbi Moline is an author of 2 books and contributes to many publications. He is a popular speaker, featured on radio, television, web broadcast, and at synagogues, churches, and organizations. He's a busy man. Welcome all of you to the evening that we have many people from all over the country and actually the world too. Martin, we're going to start with you. To start things off, why did you decide to make this film?
Well, first of all, thank you, Maggie, and to everybody at MPT for helping to organize all this, to Kristen Pentic and to Stephanie for all the work they're doing behind the scenes to make this happen. And I'm thrilled to have this event tonight with Ben Sachs and with Rabbi Jack Moline. These are 2 men who really are important in the American religious scene today. So to be able to have this evening with them is very important to me, and I'm looking forward to hearing their thoughts. I wanted to make the film. It's the 4th film in a series that I've done now, all in cooperation with Maryland Public Television, about 4 major religious characters of the 20th century. Reinhold Niebuhr, the great American public theologian; Howard Thurman, the African-American theologian who was so important to Martin Luther King Jr. and the entire civil rights movement; the Catholic activist Dorothy Day; and then finally here, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. And what I think is amazing about Heschel, as you study Heschel and look at his life, it's really not only a dramatic story, and that's what I, as a filmmaker, always have to be aware of. Is there natural drama in the story? And for Heschel, there absolutely is. But for anybody who hasn't had a chance to read Heschel yet, he's absolutely not only a prolific writer, he's a timeless writer, which is why now, almost 50 years after his passing, we're still going back and digging into Heschel as a way to have a vision about how we should be behaving and thinking about the moral issues that we have today. And so for me, I think his story was a natural to be able to bring this story. And people are saying what a timely story it is. And it really is, because he was there on the front lines in Selma. He understood how important interfaith work was, bringing the faith traditions together, and how important it was for all of us to not be indifferent about the social and political issues that we face in our own times. So for all those reasons and more, Heschel is a really important story to listen to today.
And even more important today when you think about it, because of the turmoil that's going on in our country right now, and that doesn't seem to ever go away. But it's really brought come to the forefront recently. Okay, Jack. Heschel enjoys great popularity both inside and outside of the Jewish community. Is his appeal different to Jews as to non-Jews?
Thanks, Meg. I think his appeal is very different in those two communities, even though there's a considerable overlap. To Jews, Heschel represents a link to a former culture, a former world from which he emerged, and brought the ethos of the semi-mystical Hasidic tradition to the American community. For non-Jews, Heschel was really the first rabbi who stepped out of the rarefied world of Jewish life and into an interfaith and interdenominational approach to world affairs. There were others, certainly, Rabbi Prinz, Rabbi Finkelstein, Rabbi Wise, who were voices of the Jewish community earlier. But Heschel was the first one who went to meet non-Jews in their own place, in their own communities where they were.
All right, when you say that, one of the things that I also garnered from the film is that he was very comfortable in his own skin and his beliefs. And that was so important when you look at the scheme of his whole life, or look at his whole life in general.
And it's pretty remarkable because he grew up very much in a cloistered environment until he went to university.
All right. Ben, what were Heschel's views on prophecy, and what makes them so compelling to the civil rights movement?
So in the movie, we learned a few things about Heschel's views about prophecy that make them compelling. What I'd like to do is at least offer an example of why they were compelling and how they do operate, not just today, but during the civil rights movement. If the example that I'm thinking of, and I live in Baltimore City, so I unfortunately see this often. You see a homeless person, a person who is asking for help, and most of us look away. And for Heschel, that doesn't necessarily mean that we're bad people. We have developed tools in society to make ourselves not necessarily blind, but not attuned to the suffering of others in such a way that we put our needs first. So that when you see a person who's asking for help, you look away, not because you are judging that person or that you don't want to help that person, but because you have things to do. You have to go home, you have to cook dinner, you have to help your kids with your homework. We have all of these tools that prevent us from seeing the suffering all around us. For Heschel, the problem with this is that God is actually attuned to all the suffering and at all times. It's a unique theological position that he called the divine pathos, in that human beings and God work together in order to create justice in the world as an act of completing creation, that human beings and God are in this covenantal relationship. A prophet is attuned to that suffering. And what makes this interesting is we're attuned to it as well, because there's always a gentle nudge when we look away from that person suffering, reminding us that we need to help that person. We need to look at that person. We need to take into consideration the suffering of all people, because our suffering doesn't end until everybody's suffering ends. The prophet is in partnership with God in a way that the prophet is now disclosing to all of us what God is feeling at that particular moment in time. And for Heschel, during the civil rights movement, that prophet was Martin Luther King Jr. And he saw something in MLK that was not just prophetic, but also deeply inspiring. Because I also want to remind people that Heschel came from a world in which Christian anti-Judaism played a role in the anti-Semitism that he experienced in Europe, and that his relationship with Christianity was one in which he was constantly having to protect himself from some really nasty theological views, both intellectually and physically. And yet in the United States, here was a prophetic figure, a Christian, who in some ways was actually persecuted by the same type of religion that he was, but yet found in that religion a narrative, the people of Israel, and built a civil rights movement on something that Heschel found so deep to the Jewish identity. So that, in a nutshell, would be Heschel's view of prophecy, at least for this evening.
All right. Jack, Heschel's theology has a strong mythical component, a lot like Ben was just talking about it, mystical component. At counterpoint to fellow JTS professor Mordecai Kaplan, a rationalist. How did this play out then and now?
So when Heschel and Kaplan came together at the Jewish Theological Seminary, Kaplan had been there for many years. Heschel came over from Hebrew Union College, as the film illustrates. They represented sort of two polarities. It was the 1950s, and America was in its post-war boom, and there was a strong rationalist ethos that pervaded the land, and especially the kinds of critical biblical and Talmudic studies that were going on at the Jewish Theological Seminary. That was Kaplan's contribution. He believed in Judaism as an evolving religious civilization. Heschel, as my colleague Ben just pointed out, was very much attuned to the presence of God in the world and looked everywhere he could to find a mystical, spiritual bent that would inspire people to be engaged in the world as believers and as partners with God in creation. And I can't say there were really rival factions in the seminary that surrounded these two professors, but they definitely had their different influences. There was a group that met to discuss Heschel's teachings in the seminary dormitories at midnight. And in response to that, there was a group of Kaplan's devotees who would meet at noon when the sun was at its highest point in the sky. So those were the kinds of things that went on. And the interplay between them produced a remarkable generation of rabbis, which unfortunately I missed by a few years.
I have to go over to Martin. Martin, what did you find most remarkable that maybe you did not know about Heschel?
Well, I just wanted to add another sort of footnote to what Rabbi Jack was just talking about. Heschel and his daughter always confirmed this, that Heschel always felt as though he was underappreciated by the majority of people in his academic circle at Jewish Theological Seminary. Rare is it that people feel within their own academic circles accomplished and appreciated, but certainly Heschel felt very much underappreciated at JTS, not misunderstood. Maybe that's a better way to say it. But where he did feel appreciated and understood was across the street at Union Theological Seminary, the Protestant-founded ecumenical seminary, and especially by America's great public theologian at the time, Reinhold Niebuhr. And it was actually Niebuhr whose review of Heschel's earlier book, God in Search of Man, that, Man is Not Alone, that he wrote this wonderful and glowing review, Niebuhr did, in 1951. And this in some ways put Heschel on the map, on the popular religious map in America. And these two became inseparable friends. They would walk up and down Broadway constantly talking about theological issues, one from the Jewish perspective, one from the Christian Protestant perspective. But they became such good friends and felt as though the other one appreciated them so much that they made a pledge to each other that when one dies, the other one will preach give the eulogy at their funeral. And that's exactly what happened. Now, that was unheard of in the 50s and 60s, that these two people from vastly different faith communities would actually make this kind of a pledge, but they did. And it was actually Niebuhr who passed away first, and Heschel gave the eulogy, a wonderful glowing eulogy to Niebuhr, but they became themselves an embodiment of this commitment. We're going to cross the street. We're going to come together and find ways to work together and think about the world that we have, that we're committed to trying to find solutions for. So for me, that was an important example of how Heschel wanted to live his life. He was a stranger in a strange land. He came to this country when he was 33 years old, had to learn the language. He was really not versed in English. But then if you look at the body of work that he produces, especially in the early 1950s, with the Sabbath, man is not alone, God in search of man. He becomes prolific, and he writes a lot of these books in English, which is his fourth language. So he's not only coming, and different than many immigrants who come to this country and are rather timid, Heschel feels very comfortable, and he becomes really clearly one of the most important moral authorities of his age.
That's fantastic. All right, Ben, Heschel's writings were poetic, even lyrical. How did the artfulness of his expression impact his influence as a thorough scholar?
Yeah, so as Martin was saying, Heschel had a wonderful facility with language. I mean, he wrote very eloquently in 4 languages. When he was younger, he was a poet who wrote in Yiddish. And actually, a lot of the themes that he developed in his poetry make their way into those English works in the 50s and 60s. And I think with Heschel, there's something deceiving about the simplicity of his writing, because it, in some ways, hides the great amount of learning that goes behind these really pithy aphorisms or pithy statements. His knowledge of Jewish sources were quite impressive, but he also had a deep knowledge of the German philosophical tradition. And he had this almost uncanny ability to write philosophical sentences with a devotional style. And it does mimic a Jewish tradition of writing, a Jewish tradition of quoting, in which poetry and philosophical concepts sort of come together in these sentences, because the act of writing these sentences is also some sort of connection, obviously, to God. And the interesting thing about Heschel, and Rabbi Lerner talked about this in the film, is that he talks a lot in his writing, or he writes a lot about the idea of the ineffable, the inexpressible. And this is amazing, because it's poetry that it can express with the same words that we use in the everyday world, something deeper, something more profound, in the way that they're assembled, in the way that they connect to our emotions and our thoughts. And Heschel was a master of that, which makes him a deeply compelling theologian, but also a really gifted writer.
And that's what we all need, is gifted writers to help us learn more. Okay, we're going to eventually be rolling over here to the audience, but starting with Martin, as is often the case, people inside the box who think outside the box are marginalized by elements of their community. How does the traditional Jewish world from which Heschel emerged treat his writing and reputation?
I was just going to, that's a good question. I'll get to it in a second, but I was going to add one more anecdotal kind of note
Sure.
that I had about Heschel.
We love those.
I've done a lot of webinars lately with Susanna Heschel, daughter of Abraham Heschel. And she said that she never forgot, oftentimes her father would come home late in the evening, and she would ask her father, "How was your day?" And he would say this famous line in the Heschel home. He would say, "I worked hard and I wrote one good sentence." And the whole notion of, we now look at the body, the enormous body of work that Heschel creates in really a shortened life. It's tragic. He dies at the age of 65. But he did, within his lifetime, create an enormous body of work. But when you think that he labored, we just think it sort of flows out of, like Mozart. It just sort of flows out of him. But in fact, she testifies that it was a work of love and a work of labor. It was lots of hard work. He would spend, hours and hours and hours and hours at the typewriter trying to craft the sentences just the way he wanted to craft them crafted. So I think his writings continue to stand up even now, 50 years after his passing. And I honestly do believe in 50 years from now, so looking at 100 years, you'll still be reading Abraham Heschel and talking about the scholarship for him. And one of the books that I'm drawn to is the book I just finished reading it again, The Sabbath. It's one of the I think it's one of the most remarkable short books that he ever wrote. But it's just like Ben was saying, it's constructed in such a way that the language, you want to underline everything that you're reading in the book. That's the kind of work that it is. It's just filled with quotable lines and ideas and deep theological concepts, at the same time expressed in a way that actually a layman can pick that up and read it and feel comfortable about it.
One of the other things that I looked at the film when his daughter said, because he died in his sleep, it was a kiss from God. And that was a statement that really stuck in my mind, because, you always think about people and wanting them to die peacefully. And so, in a sense, it was like his work was done, but he left his legacy for others to learn from. Anybody?
There's
Pat?
there's a passage in the Babylonian Talmud that talks about how you don't construct monuments to great sages. Their words are their monuments, and that when you quote their words, you're essentially bringing them back to life. You're infusing the world with the wisdom of their words. They are living monuments, and I think for Heschel, that couldn't be more true, and that at least the rabbis 1900 years ago, when they were thinking of that, I think probably would have had someone like Heschel in mind.
Jack, I see you shaking your head.
I agree entirely. His ability to express himself, and as Martin points out, remarkably in his fourth language, which he learned at a time when most of us have given up learning new languages and even new colloquialisms in our own languages. It was pretty remarkable. And he would write what was important to him, and they would be on slips of paper that he would keep in a file cabinet. And eventually, when he was satisfied that he had something worth saying, he would arrange them together to create these magnificent essays and chapters of his books.
Interesting. All right, I think we're going to open it up to the audience. And so I think it's really important that they have some feedback into it too. So once again, I thank you all for joining us. But all right, here we go. Here's the first one. What did Heschel think about the sufferings of the Palestinian refugees uprooted in 1947 and 48? Many Orthodox Jews in the 1940s were opposed to Zionism, but was he one of them? Jack?
Sure.
Sam?
So
Ben?
It's a great question, but it conflates a lot of things. And I don't want to take forever to answer it here. The Orthodox Jews who were opposed in the 1940s to Zionism were not doing so out of sympathy for Palestinian refugees. They did so out of a theological objection to the notion that human beings could establish a new kingdom for Israel that was promised by God. So theirs was a theological objection to the entire endeavor of a secular state. There was unquestioned. I don't know what Heschel thought about Palestinian refugees, but I will guarantee you that if his heart went out to the Vietnamese people and his heart went out to African Americans in the United States, were he aware of what was going on with Palestinian refugees, he would have been sympathetic as well. But that shouldn't be confused with his support for Zionism and support for Israel. He was probably not identified as an Orthodox Jew by the time the state of Israel was established. So you'll find that so much of what he writes, so much of what he talks about, particularly around 1967, is of the urgency of maintaining a state of Israel that can be a light to the nations, and not just another of the many states that exist in the world of nations in which we live.
I would recommend to the person who submitted the question, he writes a wonderful book called Israel, Echo of Eternity, which he writes right after the '67 war. And it's really, it's beautiful. Again, it's poetic in many ways, but what you find is a man who's absolutely in love with Israel, and the people, and sees. He talks about how in the hills you hear Alleluia sung. I mean, he's able to sort of communicate the sort of the emotional connection that he and Jews have at a time that's not so far removed from the Holocaust, when they all believed that had there been a state of Israel at that time, a place for people to go and seek refuge, how different the world might have been. And yet at the same time, there's still a famous story that I guess it was in 1970, he was teaching a class and there had been a disruption, and for which Israeli troops went in, and there were killings of Palestinians. And Heschel apparently called off class that day. He was so disturbed by that. And he spoke often about the need to recognize the Palestinians as human beings, and felt as though he already had a sense of what was going to happen. But of course, he dies in 1972, so trying now to project how he would feel today about the situation of Israel is always an impossible task. But there was no question that he had a love for Israel that was deep in his bones, saw the history of the country and the importance of it to the people, and yet at the same time a sensitivity to the Palestinians.
Ben, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I'd just simply say that his talk on the Conference of Race and Religion in 1963 may give us some insight of how he might have dealt with the suffering and oppression of Palestinians today. He like I had said with the prophets, he's very attuned to the sufferings of others, and I don't think that he was unable to see his participation or his complicity or possible complicity in the suffering of others. So it's not difficult for me to imagine that he would be a voice for Palestinians. But like Jack and Martin said, it's almost impossible to project what that would look like, because people are complicated and they change over time. But if you want to use his voice with the interpretive tools available, that's probably the essay you want to look at.
All right. We have another question. Talk about Heschel's mystical tradition, how that may or may not relate to the Eastern religions and personal experiences of God, with less emphasis on religious institutions and specific doctrine. Well, that's a tongue twister.
I can take a stab at it first, and
okay.
Give Martin and Jack some time to think about it as I ramble for a second. But I think one of Heschel's most influential doctrines coming out of the Jewish mystical tradition, the Kabbalah, is this idea called Ha'avodah Tzorech Gevua. So I'm going to let you pause for a second, and everybody can say that with me. Ha'avodah Tzorech Gevua. And it's the idea that that God is attuned to our prayers. God is attuned to our work. And I think what's important here is the word avodah in Hebrew, and in all Hebrew, whether it's modern or biblical. It means worship. It means work, like literal work, service, and that this partnership between human beings and God in the work of creation has to do with avodah. And so for Heschel, the mystical tradition that he draws from is one that says it's a lot of work to pray, right? We use the word avodah to describe that. But the work of justice is actually a form of prayer. Both are needed. It's the same word. And that these small acts or these great acts start to piece together what he saw was a deeply fragmented world. Whether or not they relate to Eastern religions and personal experience of God, you can make those comparisons, especially with his concept of nothingness and what we call aim. This idea that God has to withdraw God's self in order to create the world, and that human beings go through that same process of the word. And Jack will appreciate this. I won't go too deep into it, but the word for I in Hebrew is ani, and the word for nothingness in Hebrew is ein. It's the same letters. So how much you want to put yourself in the world and how much you want to be a vessel for God in the world is your choice, because God gave you that choice. The more of God that you bring into the world, obviously the more repair, the better the world will become. And that word in the Jewish mystical tradition is tikkun olam, which we see in a lot of progressive Jewish movements have taken to mean justice and social justice, which may not have been intended by the Kabbalists, but is actually a nice fit when you think about Heschel's work.
I'll add two quick anecdotes. Heschel is not well known in the yeshiva world, in the world that educates young Orthodox Jewish men. And I was having a conversation with someone who was the head of one of these study academies about Heschel, and he said, "Oh yes, I heard about him. He's okay because the story was a young man came to him and said he wanted to be less observant, so he's going to stop washing his hands when he got up in the morning, which is a tradition many Orthodox Jews observe." And Heschel responded to him, "How can you call yourself a Jew and not wash your hands in the morning?" Now, to most of us, that sounds kind of silly, but he believed in the doctrine and the practice of Judaism. You heard in the film his statement that synagogues have become the place where prayer goes to die. But at the same time, there was a discussion at a convention of rabbis that he attended where they were trying to do away with a Friday night service that began late in the evening after it was dark. They wanted to move it back to sunset, which is the traditional time for Jewish prayer. And it was a very popular thing to have both prayer and social time Friday night, but the rabbis didn't like it. And they were just about to vote on it when Heschel stood up and said to them, "Rabbis, Jews want to come to synagogue and you want to stop them?" And that was the end of the conversation. So I don't think you can say that he was post-observant or post-traditional in that regard, but he recognized that there were lots of different ways that were on this same path. It's one of the last things he said in his interview with Carl Stern. If God had wanted us all to be alike, he would have given us all the same faces. And I think that's something of an answer to the question.
All right. Martin, do you want to add anything? I see you kind of.
Well, not, over these years, I guess 35 years now of making films all on content of religion, faith, and spirituality, I want to say that I've encountered a lot of people who work in religious institutions. And I left after being with them for hours and wondering whether or not they themselves believed in God and whether or not God had an impact on them. God was a study. There were materials to be understood and translated and shared with other people. But whether or not, in fact, there was any sort of faith dimension or personal relationship for them with God, with their God. That was never the question with Abraham Joshua Heschel. God was writ large across his heart and his lips with everything that he did. And in fact, after having spent the last 2 years now reading his works and trying to understand him so that I could make this film, I feel as though, for me at least, the God that is ineffable, so hard to describe, is a little easier to describe, a little easier to get your hands around because of the experience of encountering Abraham Joshua Heschel. And I feel in some ways for myself personally that what I feel like God's calling me to do is a little more clearly understood because of Abraham Heschel. So if they are critical of him because he seems a little abstract or obtuse or some way out there, I take it differently. I think this is a man who actually is a conduit with his very life and his words to connect so many more of us to God.
I had a feeling as I watched the film, I kept thinking of him and under the words of inclusiveness. He was inclusive of everyone. He didn't seem to have a mean-spirited bone in his body. It's like, come on, let's see if we can't stay and be together. It's not who can be on the outside. All right. Which Jewish leader today most lives out Heschel's legacy?
Well, I'll start with one. I mean, we have two gentlemen here who are actually wonderful examples of it here on the other end in this webinar. I just did a webinar earlier this week with Rabbi Sharon Brous, and she's out in Los Angeles. I have to say, I was so impressed with her as someone who is a congregational leader, and yet at the same time gets exactly what it is that she's called to do by her God, and to share that with the people who come to see and listen for the message every Sabbath from her, and to lead a congregation out in Los Angeles, to be this new generation representation of the kind of message Heschel left 50 years ago. So she's one of the first people that comes to mind for me.
Yeah, I would endorse that. I would add somebody else who also appears in the film, and that's Rabbi Shai Held, who is a scholar of Heschel, but not just of Heschel, and has managed to achieve this synthesis of scholarship and conscience that I think is the new voice of Heschel in the world.
And so I want to say, because Heschel was a unique figure in the history of Judaism, I think that there are many potential legacies of Heschel. It's hard to replicate everything that he brought to this world. So with that caveat, I also want to add Rabbi Jill Jacobs of Truah in New York City, who is doing the work of avodah. She is doing the work of justice's prayer, and I see that as living out the legacy of Rabbi Heschel as well.
So let me point out that all three of those rabbis are graduates of the institution he had the most influence on, the Jewish Theological Seminary.
And women.
Yes.
I think Shai would be surprised to
Oh, sorry, yes, of course. I know, of course.
Out of the three. All right, next question. What is the view of the chief rabbis in Israel, both, I can't pronounce these names.
Ashkenazi and Sephardic.
Yes, thank you very much. Say them again.
Ashkenazi and Sephardic.
That's the reason why you're
saying
saying
European and the Mediterranean traditions.
Okay. Do they see him as primarily an American actor? That's an unusual question.
I think it's debatable whether they see him at all.
Right.
But if they did, and I think it is unlikely that they do, yes, they would see him as an idiosyncratic American form of religiosity that combines myriad elements of Judaism in their view into an incoherent whole. I think that they probably wouldn't read him charitably, although there are two other people here who could disagree.
I don't know what would have become of Heschel if he had gone to Palestine, Israel, rather than coming to the United States. I don't think today Heschel could be Heschel in the contemporary state of Israel.
Wow.
I agree with you.
And why would you say that?
The culture and the ethos is completely different. And Heschel, who referred to himself as the film notes as a brand plucked from the fire, brought with him a consciousness of a lost community in Europe that was still yearned for, that I don't think is part of modern Israeli culture, whether it is religious or secular, who see themselves as a 20th and 21st century phenomenon.
Okay. All right. We have a couple of more questions. What are the implications of Heschel's work for this moment in U.S. history when our society is divided, autonomized by individual pursuits, and succumbing to the materialism he saw in the 1940s and 50s?
That's a question for Martin.
Well, I think that I think the big example that he leaves is, and Rabbi Jack talked about this earlier. Imagine Rabbi Heschel loses his mother and 3 sisters in the Holocaust, has to leave the country of his homeland, leave the continent and come over here to the United States, leave the language, to learn a new language. And yet when you read his work, there's never any anger or revenge in anything that he writes, really. He's strong, he's strident in his beliefs, but still there's no anger, and there's a willingness and openness to work with the other. And what we don't see in that's exactly what we don't see in our culture today. He comes over and he becomes a central figure in the civil rights movement. So he's standing up for people who are a different color than him and who are a different faith tradition than him. In fact, harken back to the faith tradition that executed his people. And he would have every reason to be angry and stay apart from that. And throughout the course of the film, one of the things I tried to do again and again is to say at every turn of major historical moments in Heschel's life, whether it's the civil rights movement, getting involved in the Second Vatican Council, or Vietnam, there were always major opposition forces that were trying to stop him or talk him out of doing that. And he knew that all these decisions would come at a price. And yet he was willing to pay the price because he felt this was a moral decision that had to be made. And he was willing to take a chance because he felt as though the biggest sin was indifference. Indifference is the easy road in the short term. In the long term, it's the wrong path. And Heschel knew that. He was willing to take the path that would put him in the eye of the storm and knew that there was going to be a price to pay for it and was willing to pay the price. And that's what I think is the great example of his legacy.
Indifference is one thing that really is just overtaking America right now. It's like, let's show concern for all, not just a few. Picking and choosing, that's wrong. All right, let's have another question. What would Heschel's spiritual descendants, wait a minute, we're going back and forth. Okay. What would Heschel's spiritual descendants and practitioners, particularly Jewish rabbis, say about the charge that many Jewish people in America have chosen whiteness over movements to confront racism?
Boy, that doesn't presume an answer, does it?
But it's very much of what we were just talking about, not really speaking out and supporting others who are suffering. I look at our Congress right now and it's like, really?
Well, I guess I'll recommend the speech again, Race and Religion. We don't know what he would say. We know what he said. And so the spiritual descendants and practitioners, and I consider myself one of a spiritual practitioner of Heschel, is to say that Heschel was talking about whiteness at a time when people hadn't even imagined it as a structural condition by which racism endures, and then creating actors in a society where some have power and others don't, based on these constructions of race. That the charge that many Jewish people have chosen whiteness over movements that confront racism is probably a charge of every immigrant in the last 100 years to the U.S. and to consolidate this identity of whiteness, which means, at least in the spirit of this question, is something opposed to blackness. The Jewish people is as you might be surprised to know, is a complicated group of people, and there's no Jewish pope. There are Jewish communities don't have a singular point of view. And given that I work with a number of different communities in Baltimore City on precisely this question, I can say that some Jewish communities deal with this question really well, and other Jewish communities don't deal with it well at all. There is also the question of Jews of color, and how Jews of color are treated in predominantly white Jewish congregations. What's going on in the Jewish community is really just a microcosm of what's going on in the United States in terms of racism. I'd say that some Jews are speaking up and doing the work well, and other Jews not so well.
Certainly the three rabbis who were mentioned as modern-day heirs to Heschel have central in their mission, particularly Jill Jacobs, the notion of equity and equality that they arrive at from their study of Heschel and through the Jewish tradition. Now, why some Jews choose differently, that is, I think, a question that can be put to anybody who chooses differently.
Martin, would you like to add anything?
No. I feel the same, that we're looking for examples today of how people can show courage in this moment. And the one thing that I've always found so fascinating about religion is you'll find some people who will stand up, their courage and their sense of what God is calling them to do will bring you to tears. And then other people will behave in such a way that you wonder, are they reading the same texts? Are they coming from the same tradition? Do they believe the same things and they're acting this way? So I think that, as Ben said, within the context of the Jewish communities, a lot of diversity in thinking, but the politics that is really taken over so much of the mainstream American culture has clearly seeped down into the religious traditions as well. And you can see the divisions just as clear within the religion traditions, the breakdown, the politics, as you can in the main society.
And I'd also add that the deeper question is, why does America continue to choose whiteness? I mean, I don't want to go too deep in the political weeds, but even when you have African American leaders saying that our country doesn't have a race problem, that's someone who's also choosing whiteness in some capacity. Maybe not for himself, but the culture of it. So it runs deep in our language and in our societies, and we know how it's connected. But it's a problem that the Jewish community I think there are actors wanting to solve it, but it really is going to take the work of all of us to overcome this problem.
Very true. All right, we have one last question. What do you think Heschel's view would be on the struggles of women of color?
I'll put a broader perspective first.
Okay.
Like I said, I've done a lot of the events with Susanna Heschel, and she is very proud of the legacy that her father left her, because he was always encouraging her to strive as a woman, to get your studies, that you can do great things. He was even encouraging her at the time to consider becoming a rabbi. This is way back when it was not going to be possible, at least at the time. So she always felt as though her father was on the side of women from the very beginning, and as progressive as should be about all of that. And so I can only assume that all that carries, whether it's black women or white women. I think her father would have been in the forefront. There would have been no opportunity for indifference for him on these particular issues.
Yeah, I think that that the example of Susanna Heschel is very much an answer to this question. Certainly, she's not a woman of color, at least in the sense it's used today. But she never was encouraged to trade on her last name. She made her way in this world because her father and her mother persuaded her that she had gifts that were unique to her, and she has proved them right over and over again. She has a love for her father and an expertise in his teachings, but she is an extraordinary scholar and activist in her own right. And that is because of the encouragement that she got from both of her parents. It's hard for me to imagine that if Heschel were awakened to the struggle of women of color now, his response would be any different than it was to the struggle of people of color under the leadership of Dr. King.
Yeah, I think that he would follow the sources, right? So when we talk about the structural inequality of our country, we're talking about a private prison system that incarcerates the majority of African American men, which means that African American women are raising children already at a disadvantage when you see demographically where they're living and access to resources, whether through tax dollars, et cetera. A lot of us in this program probably know the history of redlining. He would add a theological voice to the empirical realities that create the structures that we live in everyday life. And when I say structures, that they're the visible structures, like the actual redlining, but the invisible one, like the question before with whiteness and the abstraction of what whiteness is and how you lean into it. He would see the struggles of women of color, I think, as very similar to the struggles of the children of Israel. He wrote, and again, I'm going to keep going back to this speech. He said African Americans had a more difficult time walking across college campuses in the South than the Israelites did crossing the Sea of Reeds. The same can be said for women of color in Baltimore City trying to get to work when we don't have a mass transit system that can accommodate a city where the majority of the people don't have cars. This is blocking God from the world. When there is a lack of justice, it's fragmenting the world. It's making the world, to use these metaphors, darker and lighter. It's bringing the capacity for indifference more to our intuition, and unless you address them here and now, the conditions for that violence and indifference are only going to grow. So I think that he would see the women of color in this country as a symbol, but also a physical reality that we are failing as a society to actually lay the grounds for an equitable and just society.
That was a brilliant answer, by the way.
Yes, it was. And
I hope my parents are listening, so they heard Jack say that. I just met him today, so I didn't.
Well, I think even more so is that this discussion in general is about a man of hope and a man who believed in all. And most of us, and in fact, almost all of us, still have to turn in that direction in order to encompass all of us. And once we all do that, maybe we'll be walking in the steps of Heschel and realizing how much we can help change the world. Well, thank you very much for a wonderful evening of discussion. And it has been exceptional, as was the film that started it all. Thank you very much. There's a wealth of information and resources on Journey Film's website about this film. The link will appear in the chat for you. So please visit that website, journeyfilms.com, but you can also visit mpt.org for more details. You will receive an email in the coming days with links to resources, as well as how you can watch the film again and this recorded discussion. So that's very important too. We want to be as inclusive as possible. On behalf of Maryland Public Television, I want to thank everyone for joining us this evening. To our panelists, Martin, Ben, and Jack, we thank you very much. It has been a true pleasure of mine to be able to help with this discussion. And to you at home, thank you very much for watching and joining us in the conversation. Have a wonderful evening. Stay safe and have a good night. I'm Maggie Linton.